been downhill since Plato. You know, we've just been screwing this up. We do not understand what human persons are. There was something about the way most scientists were approaching reality that was going to be deadly for me if I didn't make a break from it. That Corbin and Ibn Arabi, in Corbin's version, really saved my soul. What if, when you were a small child with what we call a really good imagination, what if people just said, oh, you have a really good imagination, now do your homework? Without anybody meaning to, it just taught you that all those things from the inside just weren't that important. Then eventually you're going to disappear into some sort of materialist, reductive version of yourself where your emotions are only chemistry and love isn't important and the colors are only in your head. And pretty soon, who cares? Let's just go to work.
So what is the imaginal? Is it a form of fantasy? Is it a form of cognition? Is it an archetypal dimension in depth psychology?
So you've got material world down here, far from God as you can possibly be. And then you got the pure cherubic intelligences up there to which we have limited, if any, access. And then you have the imagination, which is the whole intermediary world. Corbin brought me into a world where I simply had to take religion, spirituality, and mysticism utterly seriously. You never get anybody else's angel, and they never get yours. You only get to be fundamentalist about your experience. What if the world is not only queerer than we suppose? What if it's queerer than we can suppose? There's nothing in the physical world that doesn't infinitize itself when you start paying attention to it.
I think we are in some ways the victims of our own success in sciences, because sciences have been so successful to predict the future and to control nature.
The sciences are among the most successful, the most exciting, the most spectacular instances of imagination, but they do not get you the truth.
Welcome to Essentia Foundation channel. Thank you for watching. And today we are going to talk about how can we access the imaginal realm, the Mundus Imaginalis, where all the great visions and breakthroughs in the arts and sciences have come from, where human beings can meet their perfect nature and become the eyes by which God now sees the world, according to Iranian Sufi, Shirazi. Or have we become too literal, as many thinkers and writers claim? To answer these and other questions, we decided to talk to Dr. Tom Cheetham, a writer, lecturer, and a scholar. Hello, Tom. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much for taking time for this interview. So, you were a scientist, a trained scientist in the field of biology and the physics of complex systems. So essentially, you worked within the materials paradigm for decades in your life. However, now, currently, you're writing books and lecturing on the place of imagination in our lives and culture, with a focus on Corbin, Jung, and Hillman. You're considered an expert in this philosophical and theological field of knowledge. So my question is, how and why did you come to be an expert in this field? You could be doing a million of other things with your background. Why this? Are you a materialist or a mystic? Or both?
Oh, I'm not a materialist anymore. and I'm not a mystic.
Who are
I'm
you, Tom Cheetham?
Yeah, no, it's a really difficult question to answer. Who I'm a person looking for. I'm trying to be. I'm a person trying to be as alive as I can. And how did this happen? Um, I mean, you've caught me at a very interesting time in my life because if we'd talked, a couple of years ago, I feel as though I would have been a little more coherent. And right now I feel as though I'm in a bit of a transition stage. And I think this is really interesting for people to hear a little bit about because and it does relate to your initial question was how did I get from standard scientific materialism, which it really was, to where I am now? And the answer, yeah, I mean, I can give you the history, which I will try to do quickly. But it wasn't a choice on my part. I'm increasingly feeling as though I was following my angel, in Corbin's sense. Um, so at I can date it exactly. I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, doing complex systems work in a very minor capacity, I must admit. I was never one of the. I was having fun hanging around with the people who were really quite marvelous. And I happened upon a book in a bookstore which looked interesting, and it was by James Hillman, who I'd never heard of. And I picked it up and I started reading it. And I was 38 years old at the time, and I started reading Hillman, and I just instantly thought to myself, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for all my life. And what the it was he put the imagination at the center of reality. Now, I did my undergraduate work in philosophy, so I wasn't wholly inside the scientific worldview, even as I was doing it. And I had interests lots of other places. But when I read Hillman, I somehow knew this is the way I have to turn. I could talk more about that, but I won't right now.
It wasn't Corbin. It wasn't
Corbin. No, it was
okay.
Hillman, he died a few years ago, who was a sort of renegade Jungian. And so I knew a little bit about Jung, but not too much. I'd read him when I was in college a little, but that was years before. And I read a lot of Hillman's work and just loved it. But then as a background, you need to freshen up your reading of Jung, which I did. And 2 or 3 years into that process, I read a piece by Hillman in which he talked about Henry Corbin. And Hillman said such astonishing things about Corbin because he knew him at Aranos, that I thought, well, if James Hillman, my hero, thinks this guy is interesting, then I should look at him. So I bought myself a copy of Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and I started reading it. and I thought, what is this? This is Islamic mysticism. And he's writing about angels and the Quran and the Bible. I don't do that. I don't do that. This is crazy stuff. To sum it up, my relationship with Henry Corbin was ambivalent right from the beginning because there was something in that work which just pierced me right to the heart. And at the same time, angels, religion. I mean, what this is, I can't read this, but I couldn't stop. 30 years later, I mean, really, 30 years later, much to my astonishment, people think of me as some sort of expert in the world of Henri Corbin. And I guess I must be because people who are have liked my books. The reason I wrote the books was to make sense of this to myself. And the more distance I have from that period in my life, the more it becomes clear to me that I was engaged in what Corbin and others call a hermeneutic process, which simply means interpretation. But in Corbin's use of the term, which he expands upon from his Islamic sources, it's a kind of spiritual interpretation of the text of a book or the text of the world. And it's quite clear to me now, in retrospect, that the texts of Corbin and others were working on me as I was working on them. And it's not too much to say that Corbin and Ibn Arabi, in Corbin's version, really saved my soul. And so his work means an enormous amount to me. I'll pause there and see where you want to go with that.
Amazing story, really amazing story in my view. You as a scientist and somebody who's been really, I do my physics, I do my biology, and I teach students. And then something caught up and stayed, right? You could have just thrown the book away and said another one full of rubbish. But no, you stayed.
I can actually expand on that a little bit, and I think it might be interesting to people. There was a time during that period when I was trying to decide which path to take, because I was teaching at the time, and I was teaching biology, but I was also teaching in the humanities because it was an early environmental studies program that we were setting up, and it was part humanities and part sciences. So I had the wonderful opportunity to do a little bit of both. And in the morning, I would teach evolutionary biology, and in the afternoon, I would teach I actually taught Henri Corbin once or twice to my undergraduate students, which is a bit of a trick, but they were very good students, and they did quite well with it. But I was being torn between the two paths, and one of the questions was whether I would follow the complex systems path into what has become a really lively discussion in the neurosciences about the nature of consciousness from a point of view of complex systems. And I know the Essentia Foundation has connections to that kind of work. And so I was super interested in The Embodied Mind by Eleanor Rosch and Thompson and Varela. And so I was reading that, and I was also reading Corbin. And one day in the evolutionary biology course, it just became clear to me that there was something about the way most scientists were approaching reality that was going to be deadly for me if I didn't make a break from it. Because it's so reductive and so denying of the soul and the imagination. And I didn't really have a choice in the end. So I went with Hillman and Corbin and Jung and all the places that left me. And the denouement of that is that now, 30 years later, those threads are coming back together in my life. Because in the intervening time, there's been so much interesting work done by some of the non-standard people in the physical sciences, who themselves, some of them, are beginning to question whether a materialist paradigm is adequate for understanding reality, particularly consciousness. And so there are some ways in which these two interests, these two branches of my life are now coming back together. It's very confusing, I must say. But I feel as though that, well, it was not a detour, but that path that I took was surely the right one to take. And for me in my life, what it allowed me to do was break the stranglehold of materialist reductionism in a way that allows me to come back to the sciences, but without the ground assumption that they have the truth. James Hillman, for me, it took me many years to get this through my head and into my heart. Hillman says, well, literalizing is one mode of imagining. Oh my God. Literalizing is a mode of imagining. And you can't get away from it. You can't make your coffee in the morning if you don't take it literally. And yet, you do. One of my favorite signposts along the way here comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who says, the imagination flows, it never freezes. And what he says, I wish I could quote him, but he says, what you have to do with any of your symbols, any of your literalisms, is hold them very lightly, And when you're operating as a scientist, which I have done and love doing, it's almost impossible not to hang on to your ideas really hard. And that's fine, as long as at some point in your life, you can say, oh, okay, and you put that down so that you can do other things as well. And this long detour through Corbin, particularly Corbin, has got me to a point where I think I can do that pretty well.
I just want to go back out of curiosity, because I'm just curious. You said, I am now, you've been through amazing transformation, but you say, now I am also going through another transition. May I ask what you're referring to? What you haven't?
Yeah. Here I've been looking at the just this morning. I refreshed myself by looking at the Essentia Foundation authors and whatnot, because because one of the questions always is, how extreme can I be with whoever I'm talking to? And if you've looked at my Substack, which people should do, I think, you'll know that just recently, within the last year and a half, my world kind of crumbled. And I think people will find this helpful, whether they want to take my path or not. Because let's assume that our audience knows a little about Henry Corbin and Corbin's view of the Mundus Imaginalis and all that. Let's assume that people have some notion of that, or perhaps of James Hillman, depending on what their background was. You see, I came to Corbin through Hillman's psychology. But then once you move into Corbin, you're clearly not doing psychology anymore. You're doing theology and philosophy and mysticism. So it's a bigger world, but it surely overlaps with Hillman and surely overlaps with Jung as a Gnostic. And this is probably not the time to lay those differences out. But for me, Corbin brought me into a world where I simply had to take religion, spirituality, and mysticism utterly seriously. And so that freed me up for that. Just a year ago, 14 months to be exact, I ran across, well, okay, I'll just tell a story. I ran across a recommendation for a book by Eric Davis called High Weirdness. And the person who, and there's a subtitle, has something to do with psychedelia in the 70s in California. And the person who recommended this book, I thought had steered me in the right direction many times. And so I read Eric Davis's High Weirdness. And actually, I'm doing a class right now where we're rereading this book. And I was in the 70s, and I recognized the people he was talking about. And I read the book really fast, and it got my attention. And I looked to see who Eric Davis, what his background was, and he turns out to have been a student of Jeffrey Kripal, who is one of the authors listed on your website. So I should be safe here. And I knew Jeffrey because he'd been at a conference at Harvard that I was at just a few months before, and on Henry Corbin, which I have to say was an absolutely magnificent gathering of artists, musicians, and scholars, because at Harvard they understand Corbin as a master of the imagination. And they understand that his influence was not only on scholars of Islamic mysticism. His influence was on poets and artists and writers and philosophers and theologians and mystics. So we had some of each at that conference, and we had Jeff Kripal. So I think, I think this is really interesting metaphysically and psychologically, okay? So I listened to Jeffrey give a lecture. I forget what it was called, but it had something to do with UFOs. Unidentified flying objects. And Corbin, because, the world of the imagination. He was a lovely man. I talked to him afterwards, but I had no idea what he was saying, because UFOs, I don't do that. The paranormal, I don't do this stuff. So I didn't hear anything that he said. All I knew is he's a really nice guy. Then, after reading Davis's book, which is itself quite bizarre, I thought, oh my gosh, well, maybe I should look at Kripal's stuff. And so I read, I'm not making this up, I read 7 of his books in about 3 weeks. And what do you do with this stuff? Of course, the short version is he began as a which he still is, a scholar of comparative religion, with an interest, particularly in Hindu Tantra, and an interest in extreme religious experiences. Okay, so so it makes sense that he would eventually have gotten into extreme contemporary experiences that play with your sense of reality. Okay. Once you back off from this, it makes very good sense that Jeffrey would have gotten interested in this material. And then I started thinking about Corbin, because Jeffrey was making the argument that, well, Corbin's imaginal is one of the few metaphysical systems that maybe will be helpful in understanding these extreme experiences outside of the mystical realm. And I got looking at that article that Hillman wrote about Corbin that first brought my attention to Corbin. And Hillman, we'll leave the UFOs out of it and we'll just stay with the paranormal experiences. And Hillman quotes from a few pages in Corbin's book on Ibn Arabi, and selectively. And then he has to, because he's quoting from those pages, he has to comment about Corbin's comments about paranormal phenomena. And Hillman says, rather dismissively, oh, well, that's just literalizing the imaginal. And big fan of Hillman, so I never thought about that stuff. A year and a half ago, when I'm revisiting this, I went in and looked at those pages where Corbin talks about the paranormal, because he does. He talks about the paranormal 4 or 5 places in his book on Ibn Arabi. And Hillman says, "Oh no, we don't think about those things. That's safe. You don't have to think about that." Which was my conclusion for all these years. But if you go into Corbin, he's giving us Ibn Arabi. And one of the things, there's several instances, but one of them, when Corbin's talking about the Mundus Imaginalis and the power of the creative imagination, he says, in some people, the creative imagination, himma, the thought of the heart, in some people, it's powerful enough to create real beings outside of the heart. Okay, that's cool. That's cool. It's like art, right? Like music or painting or sculpture. Or, Corbin says, no, sometimes they can make real beings that appear right there. And then he says, well, and when that happens, usually they're visible only to other mystics. So you're safe. You see, you don't really have to think about that stuff because it would be too weird. So Hillman says, oh, the paranormal, that's literalizing the imaginal. And Corbin says, yeah, it happens. This weird physical stuff happens, but it usually is only visible to other mystics. So for 30 years, I was perfectly happy in not worrying about crazy stuff. Now, and boy, I'll give you the whole deal, and you can do with it what you want. You don't have to show anybody any of this. So, but this is honestly where I am right now. So the other thing that happened to me after reading Kripal's books and realizing that, gosh, there are people in this world who are legitimate scholars and thinkers, and there are people at Harvard who are legitimate scholars and thinkers, and we'll leave the UFOs out of it. But they're taking the paranormal quite seriously. And that was very disruptive to me. It's like, oh no, I'm 72 years old. I don't want to do this. This is too much. But and yet I just spent 30 years trying to actualize the freedom of the imagination, and I didn't have any reason. I mean, the walls fell down, and I thought, well, okay, I guess. So you see, I thought, and it's kind of embarrassing to me now, I thought that I was free and liberally open and imaginative, and I still had these blocks, these walls. These are things we do not think about because we are serious people, and we don't think about crazy stuff. And now I had to start taking crazy stuff. And as Jeffrey Kripal says repeatedly, he says, I don't really know what's going on, but I think we do have to pay attention, because throughout the whole history of humanity, weird things seem to have happened. I mean, read the Old Testament. read the New Testament. I have a student now who's so excited about this stuff because he was a Protestant pastor all his life and was taught to read the Bible as if it were metaphorical and these are just stories. And now he's really excited because, oh my God, maybe some of those miracles actually happened. And it's changing his life completely. There's so many things. So for me, 30 years ago, materialist reductionism, it really honestly took me 30 years to learn to let go of that. But I didn't see this other stuff. I didn't see this coming. But, oh no, now look what I have to deal with. And of course, the trick is you can't let go of your critical faculties. And Jeff Kripal he is the man. He is the master at this because he's got his methodological list of don't lose your mind. You can't believe everything. You have to be skeptical all the time. And so it's in that sense that I was saying before we started, I'm really confused. but here, let me continue my rant because I think it's potentially really useful for people. In the last 12, 14 months, well, some other things have happened, and that's the Brazil. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I can feel the relief, and I can feel the world brightening up a bit for me. And that this is not the first time. It's been happening slowly over these 30 years of transformation. Here's a story which I think is true enough for me with a little flourishes. What if when you were a small child with what we call a really good imagination, what if people just said, oh, you have a really good imagination. Now do your homework. Or, oh, that's lovely, dear. You have such a good imagination. Now do X and Y. And eventually, it just, without anybody meaning to, it just taught you that all those things from the inside just weren't that important. That kind of drains the color out of everything. Because if your images, what we call images, what Hillman calls images, what Henri Bergson called images, that's actually reality. And if your inner images aren't supported, I mean, some of them don't really match very well with consensus reality, and but if that, in what we call imagination, isn't fostered, if that interactive participation with the world between the inside and the outside isn't strengthened and celebrated, then eventually you're going to disappear into some sort of materialist reductive version of yourself where your emotions are only chemistry and love isn't important and the colors are only in your head, and pretty soon, who cares? Let's just go to work. So this latest revelation from Kripal and others, but his was the final straw, has just broken down so many of those remaining resistances that I had. And I think you can feel that in your immediate life. It makes you less defended and less prickly and more open. And that's what the imagination is for. I better stop and let you drive this where you want to go.
I had to hold myself a couple of times not to laugh because because you can do with angels now, but you can't do with paranormal.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. I can totally do angels.
A conundrum, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it totally is.
Angels, no problem. Paranormal and UFOs, oh my God, this is crazy stuff.
That's exactly right. And I didn't see that coming,
Fantastic. I think that's what life is all about, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to delve a little bit more into what we mean by literalism, because I think not many people understand what that really is. So if we break it down, because you're not the only one who claims that the main root cause of most, if not all the ills of our world is the excessive literalism, which can be understood as the inability to perceive reality deeply, comprehensively. And some say poetically, you already mentioned, with the eye of the heart, or with the inner sense, what Emanuel Swedenborg would say. So we say then literalism in science, as you mentioned, manifests itself as dogmatic reductive physicalism. Basically, it's an assertion that everything is fundamentally physical. In other words, that the physical or material provides the fundamental reductive base. Now, in religion, it takes the form of dogmatism, fundamentalism, right? And if we follow religious texts literally, they can lead us completely astray. So if we take an example, for example, God appearing to Moses as a burning bush. Now, let's take this literally, right? So we say in religion, then literally, the true God can only appear as a burning bush. And that's the dogmatic way to look at it. And then I would say, God forbid, Tom, that you are worshipping your God not by the burning bush, then you're a heretic, right? And we could continue and follow from there. We end up with some wars and you name it. If we take science looking at God as a burning bush, we say, what a hallucination, a neuroscientist would say, right? And then, of course, then the question is, if we take it literally, try to explain how is it possible that the bush wasn't consumed by the fire? Let's ask science to take it literally and explain that to us, right? Now, the worst part among all is that in our daily lives, this superficial perceptions and this inability to break through the surface to the deeper levels of reality may actually lead, and often does lead, to escapism and addictions in various forms of virtual reality, games, social media, and so forth. So what are your thoughts on that? Where do I begin?
Well, let's see. We could. I mean, because it'll anchor us a little bit. We could talk about Corbin. We could start a little bit with why I think Henry Corbin is so helpful here. So Corbin was allergic to any kind of fundamentalism. And in his world, he's not thinking about science. That's just not that's not something he bothers. He doesn't know anything about that, doesn't care. But he's thinking about the fundamentalism that comes along with religions. And kind of always does. Because and this is something to be thought really deeply about. But everybody takes something as fundamental, I mean, we all do, and it's necessary. I mean, I get that from Hillman, and the argument is not that you can become a totally free-floating non-entity. No, you really you need to take things literally, but it would be neat if you could do it a little bit sequentially and know when you're doing it. Say, right now, I'm going to operate as a physicist because I want to build a bridge, and I can't do that if I'm just writing poetry. I need to take this other stuff literally. But we forget that we're doing it. We forget that literalizing is a mode of imagining. And let me tell you, it took 25 years for me to get that, to take that seriously. Because there's very little in our culture that helps us do that, except the arts. And who pays attention to the arts? They're just entertainment. When in fact the arts can and should be metaphysical statements and metaphysical teaching tools. Gaston Bachelard somewhere says that poetry is instant metaphysics, but nobody takes it that way. And especially in the religions, because that's the stuff that many people take most seriously. And the problem with religions is that they're really powerful, almost all of them, and I'm not a comparative scholar of religions, but religions generally come from really weird, extreme experiences of somebody or some group of people. And every institutional form of religion recognizes that the experiences of the divine are incredibly weird and incredibly powerful, and they need some sort of container. Jung is really good about that. That the experience of the living God is not all that much fun. There's a wonderful book by a Catholic priest whose name I think is Aidan Kavanaugh, called On Liturgical Theology, which I read 15, 20 years ago, just trying to understand religion back in my pre-angelic days. And Aidan, I wasn't raised in any kind of religious tradition, and I was kind of stunned when I discovered the meaning of the transubstantiation and the Catholic Mass And Aidan Kavanaugh has a discussion in his book on liturgical theology about how powerful an experience Mass can be from what I take to be a Henry Corbin's perspective. If you bring your full hima, your imaginative powers to a Catholic Mass, you've got God in your hands and then in your mouth. And Aidan Kavanaugh has some wonderful passages about how utterly devastating and chaotic that experience could be. So there are people at the core, at the heart of all of the religions who recognize that. And that's why we have churches and popes and imams, because the power of the divine and the transcendent is really incredibly powerful. And most people just don't want to deal with that or can't deal with that. And that's fine. God knows that. God's aware. If I come down there, man, it's going to be hell, and kabang. And so we get churches. And eventually they lose their function as mediators of the divine mystery, and they become social institutions. And Corbin is so good at talking about that and refusing the authority. You have to be careful here, they were not wrong back in the times when Luther and the Protestants were trying to blow up the church. They were not wrong in thinking that, oh man, this is not going to go well, because you get this fragmentation. So Corbin's, what do you do? What do you do that? And Corbin's solution, I know what his solution is. It's a Gnostic solution. Oh gosh, I mean, okay, I have an answer to this now. It's not very satisfying. But so what Corbin says, and here he's on the same page as Jung, I think. Corbin's religion is mystical and Gnostic. And for Corbin, this is actually fun because this is the heart of his theology. He says, here come the angels, okay? And for people who may be allergic to angels in a Christian setting or an Islamic setting, or a Judaic setting, think Rilke's Angels in the Doing Our Elegies and elsewhere, because Corbin was a scholar of German thought as well, and he says, "Oh, Rilke's Angels. That's another way of talking about what I'm talking about." So that kind of gives some people access to what Corbin means by an angel. And he says, nobody ever gets God. Not Moses, not Muhammad. Nobody ever gets God because, God, it's like, that's too much, beyond anything. I mean, really, God, what you get is you get an angel. And God, being infinite, really infinite, not just big, but really infinite, can only manifest in an infinite variety. And so where the chaos is prevented is by the fact that to each person there corresponds a transcendent angel. And I don't mean to make this sound less, but that's all you're ever going to get. You're not going to get God. But the angel is God for you. This is in Ibn Arabi, because Ibn Arabi knew things. And I'm not a scholar of Ibn Arabi, so don't take anything I say about him seriously. My knowledge of Ibn Arabi comes all through Corbin. What you can, if you're lucky and work at it, have access to is your heavenly twin. And though this process, which corresponds to Jung's process of individuation to a certain extent, and Corbin for a few years was happy to make that connection, and then he realized that being too closely associated with Jung was going to make what he was doing look like psychology, which it isn't. So he then stopped using Jungian terms, but for quite a few years he was happy to use Jungian terms. So your interaction with the angel is an individuating process, and it's only for you. And here comes the Gnostic part. You never get anybody else's angel, and they never get yours. It's individual and individuating. And so here's where it gets socially tricky. So you have an experience, a genuine. And that's, how do you tell it's genuine? And the tricky part is no one can tell you because it's your experience. And if there were a book somewhere that would tell you how to do it, that book would then become the rules for an institutional church, and things would go to hell. That's Corbin's understanding of this. So it's wonderful, but it's also deeply problematic because no one else can verify the truth of your experience. The good thing is you then don't have the right or the authority to tell anyone else what their experience should be. For people who are interested in this, there's a wonderful book by William Chittick called Imaginal Worlds. William Chittick is a scholar of Ibn Arabi. And somewhere in that lovely book, he says Ibn Arabi manages to produce a theology which makes religious experience personally binding and socially relative. And that's an astonishing piece of work. And Corbin brings that to his entire theology. It's a theology of morality and personal experience, which doesn't prevent the production of institutional religion, but it gentles it up. And I have some people in the back of my mind who give me reason to think that something like this might in fact be true. But what does that mean for a social or political philosophy? Well, what if something like some of the Buddhist thinkers are right, and once you reach enlightenment, you just sort of fall in love with everything. You know, once you've had your experience of the angel, you become thereby empathetic with other beings of all sorts, you know, trees, flowers, humans. And I mean, this sounds like 60s nonsense from California, but the social problems then become much less pressing. Somebody once asked Jung if he had any hope for humanity, and he said, well, you know, it depends on how many people become self-conscious. This is kind of like that, I think. So although in Corbin's theology, in a non-institutional vision of divinity, the social theory is a little lacking, maybe, but the hope is that people will be less apt to fall into argumentation, which ends in violence. And that kind of hope for the future closes the loop, at least for me, as a kind of utopian ideal for this kind of. So you see how that's an attempted Corbinian response to the question about fundamentalist religion. You only get to be fundamentalist about your experience. I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman who we don't have to bring into this, whose experience I take utterly seriously, who said, I became God. Not me, not my ego. My ego totally disappeared. And what I learned was it's just love all the way down. End of story. And he says, but I cannot give this to anyone. You can only find it yourself, and there is no path. You have to do it yourself. And that's very much Corbin's, that's very much, I think, the centerpiece of Corbin's ecumenical theology, which he meant to apply because he was a finite human being. He was explicitly talking about the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with the addition of Zoroastrianism for reasons that we could talk about some other time. But obviously that would apply to all of them. So there's Corbin's theology of anti-fundamentalist religion.
Yeah. Religion and all the spiritual and esoteric traditions, I think those are just the pointers, right? That's the best you can hope for on the path. The rest is up to you. That's what I hear often, actually. What if we try to break it down for people? what is really imaginal? Because the term is thoroughly confused with imaginary. So what is the imaginal? Is it a form of fantasy? Is it a form of cognition? Is it an archetypal dimension in depth psychology? Or is it something else? And of course, how does it differ from the imaginary?
Yeah, yeah. It's hard. It's a hard question to answer. I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to point in some directions. I mean, in a very real sense, I was asked that 25 years ago, the first time I started talking about this stuff, and I had a lame answer then, and I kind of have a lame answer now, but I have a lame answer with a little more rationale behind it, and one of the so one of the problems for me, I'll lead you into how I'm thinking about that right now. One of the problems for me has to do with Corbin's treatment of the Mundus Imaginalis. Yeah, this is a good thing for me this is a good thing for me to lay it out this way. So Corbin adopts what he calls a tripartite cosmology from Ibn Arabi. So, and as far as I can tell, he sticks with it right to the end of his life. There are other people there's some young scholars of Corbin these days who know more Corbin than I now do because I've been away from him for a while. But as far as I'm able to tell, Corbin stuck to this right to the end, and I don't think it helps him very much. But the tripart cosmology is down here you got stuff, material things. Up there, and you've got the pure cherubic intelligences, because cherubs and all. Yeah, what is that actually? It's not quite clear. But anyway, it's way up there on his hierarchy, and this is in Corbin and Ibn Arabi also. Though I think Ibn Arabi's open to more, say, contemporary interpretations. It doesn't have to be a simple hierarchy, which makes many people these days quite nervous for very good reasons. I think Corbin, not so much. He talks about hierarchies. I think if Ibn Arabi were to come back and see what people's complaints are about hierarchies, he would have within him the resources to say, well, actually, it's not really a hierarchy, and we just call it that. It's way more complicated. It's much more like a Deleuzian network, because reality is just not that simple, But we, especially in the 12th century, you're going to say hierarchy because you go high. So you've got material world down here, far from God as you can possibly be. And then you got the pure cherubic intelligences up there to which we have limited, if any, access. And that's like not material and abstract and God knows what. And then you have the imagination, which is the whole intermediary world. And for Corbin, that really, gosh, I hate to be this derogatory, and maybe Hadi Fakhouri or somebody will correct me on this, but here's the issue. Corbin refers to the imagination and the creative imagination, and he refers to this tripartite cosmology where pretty much anything of any interest lives, which is the imagination. But then he refers over and over again to the Mundus Imaginalis, which is either coterminous with this entire intermediary realm of the imagination, or it's a special place within it. Ibn Arabi being the epitome of mystical knowledge. He says, well, of course, from another point of view, everything is imagination. Because he's Ibn Arabi, and he can see, he's been to all the states and stages, And it's that statement that, from one point of view, of course, everything is imagination. I think that in reading Corbin, it can often be unclear about the ontological status of the imagination. And I think sometimes in Corbin, everything is imagination, but then other times, no, there's this special place, the Mundus Imaginalis, and that would be where the burning bush occurred. That would be where pick your favorite moment of transcendence from any of the religions. That's where those occurred. That for Corbin, they don't occur in the literal historical world. They always occur in a place of the imagination, because for Corbin, the material is literal and has no virtualities. The category of the virtual is essential for his understanding of the imagination. And what I'm trying to get to here is, for Corbin, the Mundus Imaginalis is clearly a special place. It's a special place in the sense that it is the locus of your encounter with the divine, and therefore it's sacred. And so I feel some of the same thoughts about it that you find in Jung, when Jung's talking about particularly profound dreams, that, there's something inherently private about them. You don't want to make them public either ever or too soon, because they're so deeply personal and so sacred. And I think Corbin really focuses on that. He's saying these events are real. These moments of encounter with the divine, never going to happen down here in the material world, and they are more real than the material world. And you feel him towards the end of his life. He wrote a preface for the, second edition of Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, called Towards a Chart of the Imaginal. And in there, he's obviously annoyed. He's annoyed at James Hillman, among others, because he went to Aranos and he brought the Mundus Imaginalis, and now look what the crazy Americans are doing with it. And, you can feel his annoyance. And there's a long story there. Because I think what we have to say is that Hillman, as a practicing psychologist, he looks at his patients and he realizes that they're down in these deep places where there's darkness and monsters and there's angels too. And Hillman is just saying, well, that's all the imaginal. I've been listening to Corbin at Aranos for years, and this is all real. These things are all real. And Corbin starts to get pretty nervous. I'm making this up, obviously, but it's what I believe. And Corbin starts to see that, oh my God, I've tried to bring this special sacred thing to Aranos so that, well, why? So that Western culture can begin to have access to the sacred again, which is only available through the imagination, through the creative imagination. But he didn't foresee that. he didn't plan ahead, and he didn't realize that. And he should have, because as a young man and as an old man, he was perfectly willing to take examples from every culture and to pluralize and to bring the heretics together. There's a nifty little story. His friend Denis de Rougemont, the guy who wrote Love in the Western World, late in their lives, he said to Corbin, when you were a kid, you used to say, heretics of the world, unite, because you were making fun of the Marxists. And Corbin says, I never would have said heretics of the world unite. I must have said esotericists of the world unite. And Denis de Rougemont says, nuts. No, you said heretics. And all Corbin's life, he was looking for the heretics because they were standing at the fringes of the fundamentalist religion. And he thought, if you want to see the real religion, you go to the fringes. You go to the crazy people on the outside. And then, but then when he sees what's happening in Hillman in particular and some others, he gets very nervous. And I think it was his sense that Hillman and others like him were threatening the secularization of the sacred. Now, that tension is not going to go away. But all these years later, our question here is, what is the Mundus Imaginalis and what is the imagination? And I think, I'm really confident about this now, about what I think, that is to say. I was always really reluctant to break so fundamentally from Corbin and maybe Ibn Arabi, although we got to give up that tripartite cosmology and admit that it's all imagination and then work with the consequences of that. And why do I say that? I mean, for a lot of reasons, but one is I have a background in the sciences and it's all imagination, I mean, it's just all imagination. What else could it be? I mean, I always have a rock handy because, I mean, if anything's going to be fundamental, it's good in the sciences, it's going to be geology and rocks. And it's not that they're going to disappear on you. I mean, there is something to this whole matter business. But if you take your basic rock and you talk about it with a quantum physicist, it disappears into vibration and energy. It's vibrating really fast and really little, and which is why it seems solid to us. But it's not really real. What do you mean by really? And then you look at this rock, and if you know any geology, all of a sudden your brain's just full of ideas and associations and analogies. And the rock, it's still there in some sense, but suddenly it's an entire universe of, if you know any geology, it's an entire universe of crystals and deep time and dinosaurs. And there's nothing in the physical world that doesn't infinitize itself when you start paying attention to it. So Corbin's tripartite cosmology, even at the level of matter, just won't do, because it's imagination all the way down and all the way up. Then, of course, you're still left with this nagging problem of the difference between fantasy and reality. Because you can make stuff up that doesn't exist, except there's a long tradition, which I'm in some future life I will learn about. There's this long tradition of people wondering about that. William Blake, famously for me at any rate, says, anything that can be believed is an image of the truth, which you could translate as, if you can think it, it exists. And so here you would bring in Bruno Latour. Now, this gets so, this is so exciting to me. Let me just do this for your listeners. So Bruno Latour is a sociologist of science and a philosopher, and a really good one. And he wrote a big book about the many modes of being, and I can never remember its title because it's almost the same title as a book by Etienne Souriau, who we'll get to in just a minute. And Bruno Latour has a wonderful attempt at an ontology of pluralism. We've got to give up Corbin's tripartite cosmology and make things in that middle realm, give them their due. Okay. And I think if Corbin had been in a later generation of French thinkers, including, by the way, Henri Bergson, in whose generation he was, if he'd paid attention to Bergson and Bergson's suggestion about images, which that's another talk entirely, but I'm heading in that direction, he might have had to back off of his tripartite cosmology and say, oh gosh, it's going to be a lot of work, but okay, we can have an ontology of modes of being, which in fact he did. That's another story. And so Bergson and Latour and others, probably Deleuze, and others are perfectly willing to see material realities in metaphysically new terms. That is to say, I mean, I have to say, many people, scientists among them, are still stuck with Cartesian and Newtonian fundamentals. And I mean, that is really old stuff, you know. Nobody in the sciences really believes in the billiard ball theories of Descartes and Newton. It just doesn't work. But it seems to me that as societies, many of us haven't yet totally made the transition, and one of the reasons is because it's really complicated. The question then is, if you're going to have a cosmology of the image in something like Bergson's sense, or flow and whatever it is that Deleuze does, is it possible to retain something like this notion of the unifying individuation of the sacred? And I don't know the answer to that. I think there probably is. But in any case, let's stay with this just for a moment, because it's a connection for those of your listeners who may have an interest in Corbin and how to bring him into the 21st century. I guess really that's been my job for the last 30 years, and it's not easy. You know, because he said once to, I think, to Robert Bosnak, he said at Aranos, he said, well, you know, all of my contemporaries have been dead for 1,000 years. And he felt very much alone, you know, because he was really a Neoplatonist and there just weren't very many of them around, you know. And so you take someone who very much felt grounded in this ancient tradition, and you know, let's modernize him, which is a legitimate thing to do. And in fact, he argues the same for Avicenna and Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi. He makes exactly that point, that they can be brought into the future so that there can be a future for their vision. And so in a sense, I guess that's partly what I'm trying to do here. And the connection with Bruno Latour, for instance, is really, I don't think it's tenuous. Latour is treating beings in a very generous way, almost in an animist way, and that absolutely, there's so much here, but that absolutely overlaps with Corbin, because as a Neoplatonist, he quotes, for example, he quotes Proclus, and I think this is in the book on Ibn Arabi. He quotes Proclus about the flower, the heliotrope, which follows the sun in its path during the day, and by so doing is praying to its God insofar as it is possible for a plant to pray. And so Corbin is totally in this animist cosmos where every being of light has an angel. Even the flowers have angels, okay? I don't think that that's too far distant from the kind of ontological pluralism that's implicit in some of the things that Bruno Latour is doing. And one connecting link between Latour and Corbin is a long forgotten French philosopher, Etienne Souriau, who Corbin knew at the Sorbonne and who was a philosopher of art. And there's an extremely important footnote in Corbin's book on Ibn Arabi about Etienne Souriau and Souriau's use of the metaphor of the angel. It's one of the most important parts of that book, the footnote about Souriau. Lo and behold, all these years later, Isabelle Stengers and Bruno Latour discovered Etienne Souriau, and they were so excited about Souriau's ontological treatment of the world that they had a new French edition published, which was then translated into English. And their introduction to that book is just fabulous. And for me, of course, it was super exciting because it connects Corbin via Souriau to Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stengers, who's a philosopher of science who worked with Ilya Prigogine years ago on complex systems theory. So for me, it's, oh my gosh, seriously, these things really do fit together. And then, just to add one more little sparkle to the mix, turns out that Gilles Deleuze refers to Etienne Souriau in at least a couple places. And because Souriau uses the idea of the virtuality of the angel of the work of art in his understanding of the creative imagination in artists. So what I'm saying is here, I'm at least saying that for someone who is creative and interested, there's the skeleton there of an extraordinary continuity of ideas between, if you wanted to go all the way back, between Corbin's reading of the Zoroastrians and Gilles Deleuze, although I think that's probably overstating it a little bit. But in any case, another thing that comes in here, not just in Latour, but in others as well, and I'll suppress the references, is the idea of an animist cosmos. And one of the things that I'm trying to suggest, and it's merely a suggestion, is that once you give up materialist, reductionist rationalism, it becomes, gosh, I would say almost inevitable that you're going to see consciousness spreading outside the human brain into what we have thought of since at least Descartes as inanimate matter. And of course, that begins to raise so many questions about, well, what is the relationship between the brain and the mind or the soul or consciousness? And yeah, how do I even say this? So one of the things that is of interest to me now, and and gosh, we were just doing this in class yesterday. Uh,
Synchronicity.
yeah. How do I even say this? So one of the things that is of interest to me now, yeah, let me do this for your listeners. I'll just point them in some directions. If it's true, as James and maybe Bergson and a few others, and maybe some contemporary neuroscientists are wondering, if the brain doesn't, maybe if it's true that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, and it's not how, I mean, kind of how could it? But this is a tough one for me. But if it's true that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, but is rather a transducer of consciousness or a filter, James wondered about this. Uh-oh. Then, oh boy. Well, it explains a lot of things, but it leaves a huge number of things unexplained, which, by the way, I think is absolutely necessary for the survival of our species. The title of my new course, the course that we're doing now, is Embracing the Unknowable. And as a little footnote here, in the Western technological world, we've lived for a few hundred years assuming that we can know pretty much anything we want, that the universe is somehow open to our understanding, and that if there's something we don't understand now, we will understand it at some point in the future. What if that's not true? What if, as J.B.S. Haldane said at the turn of the 20th century, what if the world is not only queerer than we suppose, what if it's queerer than we can suppose? What if we really thought, as many medieval theologians did, that we're finite and the world is infinite and we cannot ever understand it all? We can only understand little chunks of it. If we really took that seriously as a culture, I think we'd be more humble. It probably would work out a little better than this knocking materials around in space. That was a footnote. What I'm interested in is some of the things that are implied if meaning doesn't reside in your brain. Since maybe the year 1100, according to my history professor, we've had what he called it, the intensive self. He said for Aristotle and the ancients, they had what he called an extensive self. So Aristotle could say, geez, I don't really quite understand it, but somehow everything is in my head, and my head is somehow in everything. And I don't really understand how that, and then somewhere along the line in Western culture, it turned out that consciousness is inside your head, looking out of your eyes, and language is all about human meaning. Okay? And for hundreds of years in the Western tradition, language is up here and refers to things in the world. What if that's totally wrong? What if consciousness is infinite and we just have little tiny, tiny, tiny fragments of it? That suggests that meaning, in some sense, which I have no idea about, means that language is somehow extra human. It's more than human. And so one of the little side shoots of the things that I'm interested now in is sort of extreme experiments in language. Like Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian novelist, her book Agua Viva almost feels as if it comes off the page into your heart and does things in the material world. And if you haven't read Lispector, you must. Hélène Cixous, the French philosopher, was the one that turned me on to Clarice. And Hélène Cixous writes about language in a way that makes it seem almost palpable. Poets often do that. And there's a poet who died 10, 12 years ago in the United States, Leslie Scalapino, whose work is so extremely impenetrable that it almost does come off the page. And I could go on and on. There's other examples, but I'm super interested about the materiality of meaning, which, okay, I can draw this to a conclusion in about a minute. The reason the picture of Brazil is behind me is because 12 months ago, after I had read 7 or 8 of Jeffrey Kripal's books and was totally flipped out by them, I went to Brazil at the invitation of a very good friend and was initiated into the Bwiti religion from the west coast of Africa, and forget why it's in Brazil, but it was. And that was my first experience with well, it's not really a psychedelic, with a sacred plant medicine. Never had done that before. And this particular sacred plant is iboga, Tabernatha iboga. And I didn't know what I was getting into. And I'm very glad that I didn't. And after last year, I came back. I was just there a few weeks ago. So here's my takeaway in very short. Something funny happens in that particular experience for me, which seems to occur somewhere near the interface between body and language, or matter and mind, or substance and meaning, which totally undoes your framework for reality in ways that are a little more powerful, but not that conceptually different from the kind of work that Kripal is doing, if you see what I'm saying. And 30 years of playing and struggling with Corbin's ideas about the creative imagination now seem to me to be, for me, a necessary prelude to these more extreme kinds of experiences, from which I conclude that life is really interesting.
You know, I was just wondering for myself, why is it so difficult for us, especially in the West? Because, I mean, different cultures have a different approach a little bit, to understand what the imaginal realm is and what is imaginal versus imaginary. And I think one of the answers I found actually in one of your lectures, I think we are in some ways the victims of our own success in sciences, because sciences have been so successful to predict the future and to control nature. And it's so comforting because we want to be grounded. It's far better to be in a controlled situation, controlling situation, your external environment, rather than being utterly derooted and without any foundation. So because of that, we sort of lost openness for the unknown, for the unpredictable, and for the transcendent. And we sort of close ourselves up to that. I think that's my conclusion a little bit, but I wonder if you want to relate to that in some ways.
That sounds absolutely right to me. And then, now dragging myself back 30 years, it's quite astonishing the amount of things that we can understand. I mean, it's really kind of remarkable. And look, see, one of the things that's been important to me through this 30-year journey is it would be maybe not easy, maybe not even easier, but it would be simpler to just say, oh, poof on science. Well, I can't do that. I can't do that. I know how wonderful it is, how revelatory it is. I love the sciences. And one of the reasons I love them is because they change your experience of the world. I had the glorious opportunity to be a dilettante in many sciences. As a teacher of undergraduates at a very small school, we could do whatever we wanted. And it wasn't just my experience. It was the experience of the other biologists there, Brad. We were just two of us. And when we took the biology department apart and gave ourselves which courses we wanted, he said, well, I'll do botany. And he was a human and physiologist. He didn't know plant. And he said about, a third of the way into that botany course, he just said, oh my God, I go outside and I almost go crazy. There's so many plants, and that happens, that kind of thing happens every time you become entranced with something in the sciences. It happened for me in physics. It happened in mathematics. It happened in computer science, geology. I mean, we got to play in the fields of the Lord, as they used to say. And every one of those sciences was a window onto a different way of seeing the world. And it's glorious because as a natural scientist, and still as a reductive materialist, you can back off and you can say, oh, yes, in the morning I teach geology, in the afternoon I teach genetics, and they're all kind of on the same materialist plane. You're not messing around with your soul and with your, though I would say you're messing around with the thought of your heart, So I don't want to give any of that up. So that was one of the reasons, oh, no paranormal. We're not doing that. And we're certainly not thinking about UFOs. Because I didn't understand, and for a very long time, during those initial years, I stopped teaching the sciences, moved to Maine. During those initial years, I was fully gung-ho on Corbin and the angels and trying to move in some fairly real way into that world. And ecological science was a good way to do that. One of my favorite books, and a book that was useful to me in many profound spiritual ways, was David Abrams' book, The Spell of the Sensuous, which is, I think it was, it's been out for many, many years now, and it's still a work of genius. And what Abram was doing, and here comes kind of an answer to your question. What Abram was doing as a philosopher was trying to understand the difference between the worldview of the indigenous people with whom he had lived in Southeast Asia for some time and modern America, where he had to come back and he found it phenomenologically trying. Let's put it that way. There's some marvelous passages in that book. He landed back on Long Island after years in indigenous communities, and it nearly drove him mad. And he had to figure out some way to change his state of consciousness so that he wouldn't be assaulted by modern American culture. And then he wrote a book about how to do that, which now's not the time, which overlapped for me with many of the things that I was learning from Corbin. So one way for contemporary literalists to loosen themselves up is simply to travel, but not to travel as a tourist, to travel as people used to travel. Although, no, you don't want to do that because that was all colonialism and imperialism. But to travel as an anthropologist might travel, or at least as a contemporary anthropologist might travel. The old ones tended to be pretty derogatory about their subjects, but contemporary anthropologists are really here's a connection which addresses your answer. Contemporary anthropologists, being very, very aware of the problems of imperialism and condescension and coloniality, have been trying for decades now to say, maybe these primitive people actually experience the world in a really different way than I do, and that it's no worse than mine. And actually, in a lot of ways, it's a way better than mine. And what I've seen, and this is totally anecdotal, but in my reading over the last few years, it's become apparent that at least some of the best anthropologists then start collaborating with artists. They come back home and they think, I could give you a couple names, but I won't because I don't remember exactly who they were. But you look at their CVs after they wrote some marvelous book about the people that they were studying with, in which they were clearly thinking, boy, this is a really great way to live, which has lots to recommend it. How do you keep that going? You start a theater group, or you start playing music, and I think this all comes back to Corbin and the imagination. And here's here's another thing that we're thinking about. I got to talk about it in class tomorrow. For Corbin, one of the central themes, and it takes a while to understand this, one of the central themes in his theological cosmology is actually music, because he was a musician and he uses musical metaphors as what he says the best possible expression of the profound sympathy of beings from one hierarchical spot to another. I'm botching his language there, but I don't think, you cannot understand what Corbin is trying to do without understanding the central place of music at least as a metaphor for him. Now let me move to another contemporary who just died a few years ago, who makes a similar and overlapping argument. George Steiner was another of my favorite authors, in an astonishing book called Real Presences. We can't go there except to say that Steiner thought that music and the arts in general, but music in particular, could only be understood by what he calls the wager of God. He's deeply theological and extremely sophisticated as a literary critic, although calling him a critic, it does him a grave disservice. He's one of the great writers about literature and the arts, admittedly in the high culture tradition, and he argues that the arts are so suffused with the categories of the human person as a potentially divine being, that the arts can't be understood or experienced or made without at least an unconscious connection of that sort. So bring that to answer our question about the imagination, music and the arts and literature. If you lose contact with those, if you're the kind of literalist, pick your favorite literalism, Marxism, feminism. I mean, any ism, pick the ism that you love the best, and we all love several. I have many of them that I love. And then just recognize, what are they preventing me from doing and seeing and experiencing? Because any of these isms, I think Deleuze would call that territorialization. Any of these isms, they're useful. They're super useful for doing certain things, but they will always close off other opportunities for you. My argument is that the imagination is everywhere. There is nowhere that there isn't imagination. And where we go wrong is to think that what we're doing isn't imagination. And as
including
soon
science. Including
absolutely.
science.
Oh no. That's exactly right. That is totally right. And my argument is that the sciences are among the most successful, the most exciting, the most spectacular instances of imagination, but they do not get you the truth. And that there are times when there's a great story about some German physicist in the late 1800s, and he wasn't alone. But he was telling all his students to go into business because in 1880, science, there's nothing left to do, he said. We know everything. And so there's going to be no future in the sciences. And you should go into business. Well, it didn't turn out that way. But once you recognize that the power, and here comes the politics again, once you recognize that when you've generated so much power to do things, and you assume that you understand what to do with that power, it's going to go off wrong because you do not understand. There are things you do not understand. And if we all really had that as like this primary imaginative construct, then we would be less apt to act because we do have the power, because we do understand things. We know how to destroy things, but we're very bad at. And here comes what could be a kind of conclusion. And it comes right out of Corbin and into George Steiner and into others. Lucy Irigaray. It's right in Lucy Irigaray. What we're very, very bad at, for reasons of the sort we've been talking about, is the thought of the heart as it relates to another human being, particularly another human being. We're very bad at plants and animals. We're bad at the ecosystem. The central image in Corbin's theology is the pairing between a human and their angel. So that's the transcending image from which is suspended his entire cosmology. And every human-to-human interaction is an image of that. Okay. So here's the real answer to how to retrieve the imagination. I'm not claiming to be good at this. I'm the theorist. Okay. What do I want? I want Lou Andreas Salome and Luce Irigaray. two women who understood this. So Lou Andreas Salome was famously the companion of Nietzsche, Freud, and Rilke. She was Rilke's lover, but she was the friend and companion of Freud and Nietzsche. So she was traveling in some pretty heady circles. Nietzsche, and this may be not true, but I have seen a quote where Nietzsche said, "Oh yeah, smartest person I ever met," you know, and she was a Freudian, quasi-Freudian analyst. And she wrote a letter. I get this from a spectacularly wonderful book by Kaya Silverman called Flesh of My Flesh. She talks about Salome, and she quotes from a letter that Salome wrote to Rilke. And she said, oh, do I have the quote? I have it very close at hand. She said to Rilke, you know, we were like primal siblings, and our connection was, what she's saying is our connection was fated, and it was ontologically significant. That's not how she puts it, but she says, when we came together, it was not two halves seeking each other. It was the sudden existence of what she called a surprised whole, which then was ecstatic. And that ecstasy extended, she said, even to the dusts of the universe. That, for me, is a magnificent articulation of Corbin's vision between the angel and the human. And any human relationship, it's pretty rare for something like that to happen down here. But Salome and Rilke proved that it's possible. And that's what people are kind of capable of. And now we'll bring in the magnificent Luce Irigaray, the French feminist philosopher, who says in one of her more recent books, the name of which I can't remember, she pulls a kind of Heideggerian turn, and she's a student of Heidegger, among many other things. But she says, you know, I don't think we can understand the entre nous, the between us, by which she means something quite special. I don't think we can understand the between us unless we go back to the pre-Socratics. Her intuition is it's been downhill since Plato. You know, we've just been screwing this up. We do not understand what human persons are. And we cannot understand this astonishing potential of relationality between two persons unless we go back, all the way back in Western thought, and try to undo some of the mistakes we have made. And to fast forward to Corbin and, you know, a couple thousand years after the pre-Socratics, I mean, Corbin thought, yeah, something's wrong in the West. I think we lost touch with the imagination. And if we go back to Persia, Suhrawardi, and them, maybe we can resuscitate this and we can get ourselves back in some sort of truly human ability.
But I want to defend Corbin, not that he needs to, with a book of yours, which is All the World an Icon. Excellent book, we recommend. And if you permit me, I will quote you.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yes. So Corbin believed, along with Ibn Arabi, that the imagination lies at the very center of reality. So he actually thinks, and he thought imagination is everything. So I'm not sure that we should dismantle his or modernize his cosmology because some degree of organization needs to happen, right? And we call this emanation. And if we look at Neoplatonics, and if you look at Suhrawardi philosophy, and Suhrawardi, in his philosophy, Alam al-Mital, the imaginal world, he says, plays a role in mediating between the world of forms and that of pure essences. So, being the timeless dimension, it can be accessed by active imagination, a particular faculty of the soul. So, there are too many people, wise people, saying the same thing. So, I would say, let's stick to the cosmology they propose. Because it's all what I'm trying to say is that we say it's all imagination, but at the same time, it doesn't need that we dismantle or change the cosmological order of Corbin, because it's all imagination. It's just the way how you look at it, how it's organized, how it's received by people. In this case, Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi. What would you say?
Let's see. I don't. Yeah, in my own practical, yeah, it's you can read this as you can read this psychologically rather than philosophically if you want. And I think that the distinction between those two is very, very fluid, as Corbin did. The tripartite cosmology, if you want to keep that, I mean, you can if you want, but, but I can't.
No,
Why?
no, just a second, just a second. Wait, I'm not sticking to a specific cosmology, but the principle of emanation and those layers of organization are the same. Because if you look at Suhrawardi, it's not 3 layers. He sees a lot more. The same with Neoplatonics. I don't think it's 3 layers. There's stuff above the angelic realms. So between angelic realms and the Godhead, so to speak, the one. So it's the principle. It's the how you slice the reality, which slice you're looking at. It's all imagination. That's true. Given.
Yes, it is. It is. It's totally all imagination. All right, but you're interested, at least for the moment, in hanging
in philosophical
on to
part.
In emanationist cosmology. Here's where I think I am personally right now, which is I am floating in uncertainty in a world where the potentials for experience seem to have opened up. That is poorly put, but partly because of the Brazil experience. And let me talk very briefly about that, because that wasn't philosophizing and it wasn't conceptual. It was the experience with the Iboga initiation was incredibly intense physically and emotionally, and my articulation of the experience afterwards has to emphasize the fact that much of what went on over a very wretched 36 hours was below the level of consciousness, but just below. And it was a very busy time that seems to have involved activities between the somatic and the liminal psychic, which cannot be brought up into language or ideas. And the end result of that particular experience is that, among other things, I have no idea what was going on. I know people who are in that tradition who will point me to things. The reductive materialist in me totally gone. And insofar as he's still in here, he doesn't care whether that experience can be explained in a reductive materialist way, because it brought with it new, there's no way to talk about it. But the point that I'm trying to get at is that I'm in no position to have a cosmology. that's what I want to say, and yeah, that is exactly what I want to say, and it may turn out, give me 10 years, and I'll come back and I'll say, you were totally right about that emanationist scheme. You were totally right about that, but right now I feel like a 3-year-old, Just let's start this over again, see if we can get our metaphysics right. But we need more experiences. And I think that's Kripal's, that's Jeff Kripal's take on this. And I bless his soul for changing my life. He said, I don't know what's going on, but I think we need to pay attention to a little more than we're used to paying attention to.
Okay, but philosophers in us, if we had to summarize metaphysics, from point of view of metaphysics, where the model of Corbin, Suhrawardi, Ibn Arabi, and others point us to. What's the nature of reality? I would say mental. It's all mind. It's all imagination. Or something else?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just, after all these years, it just occurred to me, a few months ago, I'm an idealist. I didn't know that. I never.
It took us an entire interview to finally figure out who you are. Asked you, are you materialist? Are you mystic? You could have just said I'm idealist in the interview.
I'm an idealist, I guess, but I'm an idealist who loves. But it becomes very difficult to use a label like that, because I'm an idealist who knows a lot. I spent, 30 years looking into microscopes as a biologist. I love micro things. And when you spend 30 years looking at invertebrate zoology and entomology and physiology, you begin to have some appreciation for detail, the exquisite beauty and detail of everything that exists at every level. And I'm sorry, it's not mind. It's stuff, but it makes no sense to be a materialist. So I don't know what I would call it. It's not, I think, you see, that's one of the reasons I have problems with Corbin's tripartite cosmology, because I think at this point we have to give up any simple distinction between idealism and realism as they were often understood in the past. But if I had to come down on one side, idealism for sure. Absolute. It's got to be consciousness or something like consciousness. But the other thing that we just absolutely have to keep front and center is that our words are just words. Um, that is to say, they need to mean things that it's very, very, very hard to make them mean, which is why, and here's another thing to bring around, which is um, James Hillman and George Steiner and even Corbin himself. Hillman's phrase here is the poetic basis of mind. And I think something that he meant by that very pregnant phrase applies to the sciences as well. But one thing that's a bit frustrating as a scientist for all those years is that most people have no clue about the beauty and grandeur and astonishment. Just walk outside and look down. You spend the rest of your life studying whatever it is you just saw. And so that sense of reality has to carry into this kind of idealism. Otherwise, it will just be abstract. And that won't do.
And if I were a devil's advocate, I would say idealism is also one of the ways of imagining the world, right?
Yes. And that's a point. That's a reflexive point that Hillman is really good at making, and Jeff Kripal, by the way, because one of Jeffrey, and I'll give him another plug here because his work is just spectacular. One of his fundamental metaphors is this hermeneutic circle. Which he gets partly right from Corbin, because it's right there in Corbin, the creative imagination, and Corbin's hermeneutic. That's another central theme in Corbin is this hermeneutic. And so that one of the problems with literalism is that you stop interpreting and you say, bang, this is it, we got it. And Corbin calls for a permanent hermeneutic, which I love. Permanent hermeneutic of holy texts. From the scientific point of view, that would be you'd recognize that your work is always hypothetical. And the notion of science as progress with hypotheses is, in that sense at least, a hermeneutic process of imagination. And what happens is we think we've got the truth, and then we realize we have powers, and then we use our powers, and we don't have the truth. Our truth is always partial.
What struck me in one of the interviews that you gave or podcasts, that you actually said that Western materialism is destroying the world, and there are more ways of imagining the world than reductionist materialism. What do you mean by destroying the world?
And I taught environmental studies for 20 years or more. And back in the 80s, we thought once people understood what was happening that things would change. But they haven't, because there's the machinery of, and I have very strong opinions, but I'm not a social theorist, and I'm not a political theorist, and I'm not even a very good historian. So my practical suggestions and my analyses of current affairs should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. But capitalism doesn't recognize these kinds of realities. And the capitalist machinery of the modern world has an extraordinary, what would you say, momentum, and it's very hard to stop it. And boy, a simple answer to the question of why materialist ideology is destroying the world. There isn't a simple answer. Because, and there's not, I think there's not one primary place to push on the contemporary political and economic systems to make them stop. I actually think they're going to have to grind to a halt on their own. Philosophically and spiritually, there's so much to be said. In the developed world, and I know there's better ways to say that these days, in the rich world where I live, even the poorest among us are spoiled by the availability of pretty much anything we want if we have enough money. And we are deluded, and the people who go to fundamentalist religions are not wrong about this, I guess. We're deluded into thinking that the most important things in life are material. And I have the intuition that many, got to be awfully careful, many people in the societies that I have grown up in are unable to experience, something as simple as the joys of, I sound like a throwback to the 60s, and I really am, the joys of a simple life, the joys of, and now I sound like one of the Christian fundamentalists in the United States, the joys of family and the simple life of it's so hard to balance your vision of, well, here's a way to think about this, I think. And I'm not the only person saying this. We, by which I have to mean white North American males, because that's the only we I really am a part of. We have to begin to imagine alternative ways of living that we think would be sufficient and fulfilling. And what's the word people like to use now? It's not going to come to me. Flourishing. What would it be like to flourish in a different way than going to work 9 to 5, making as much money as you can so you can pay your health insurance, so you can take care of your kids, so they can get in a good college, so they can go to work in a whatever. I've been watching this happen since I was conscious at 20. And it hasn't gotten better. It's only gotten worse. And some famous person who I don't remember from the 60s was quoted 20 years ago as saying, all the things we were worried about in the 60s have happened, and much worse than we thought they would. The corporate takeover of X and the continued mining of beautiful places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, 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 very easy to get terminally depressed about this stuff. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. That's very unhelpful. This doesn't help you. It doesn't help anybody else. What might help is, what's an alternative that would be legitimate for you right now? Okay, I can't move out of my apartment in the middle of X city, but what little things could I do? And et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is standard environmentalist. The thing, if I had to point to one thing, and it's not one thing. And that's the trick. It's the constellation of ideas and sensibilities that come along with Lou Andre Salome's vision of love, or Corbin's vision of the relation with an angel, or George Steiner's notion that art and music in particular is based on what Steiner calls a fundamental answerability. That is, a work of art calls for an answer. Corbin's angelic twin coupling calls for, dialogue's the wrong word, communion is the right word. And I find in people who work in the arts and music, and sometimes elsewhere, a really profound sense of the richness of being. In some of the people who were in charge of our Duity ceremony in Brazil, not all of them, because they're all, modern people, but some of them have at least some connection to that primordial sense of kinship between humans and among humans and other beings on the planet. That's maybe doesn't seem like much in the grand forward crunch of capitalist reality, but it does seem to me that without that springing up in as many places as possible, there's no chance of doing anything but jigger with the mechanics of the economy. So as individual human beings, you can boil this all down to something simple and useless, like be kind and loving. The point, though, is that what comes along with that, what is the necessary, but perhaps not sufficient condition for that kind of kinship and community is a fullness of experience that can, I think, be encouraged by certain kinds of natural science, as long as it's taught in the right way, as long as it's presented in the right way, and certain kinds of art. What people need, he said, by which I mean what I need, is continuing reminders of the wonder that being alive really is. I mean, I think it was like Rilke's last words while he was dying in agony were something like that. He said, "Never let them forget that living is glory." And people don't know that. Most people don't know that. And they don't, even people who are well-to-do. And if they don't know it, So it seems to me that at the level of practicality and, the little tiny screwdriver level, is people need to wake up a bit, and which things are important. And so that's the foundation of imagination. I said, one of the things I recognized when I was first teaching, I was, trying to teach intro biology, which is, it's a textbook, it's kind of boring. And it occurred to me, what they have to do is they have to become imaginatively engaged in the material. And at the time, I really didn't know what I meant. But I was telling them, look, you can't just read the book. You have to pretend you're an oxygen atom. You have to get inside the material. If you don't, I mean, chemists, they don't, You really have to use your imagination. Talk to, even mathematics is like this. In fact, I mean, really, especially mathematics is like this because it's so abstract. And so the best mathematicians don't experience it that way. Oh, great story, great story. There's a spectacular spectacular book by Stefan Alexander called The Jazz of Physics. And he tells, among other astonishing stories, he's a black man at Brown University, or at least was at Brown. He's a theoretical physicist and a very accomplished jazz saxophone player. And he talks in that book about the astonishing overlaps between music and theoretical physics, which of course is all mathematics, in a way that I don't think anybody can. I mean, anyone would find this just astonishing. And he tells several stories, but the one that's easy to tell is the story about Einstein. People asked Einstein, well, where do you get your ideas? And he said, well, actually they're musical ideas. And his wife, Einstein's wife, apparently said, yeah, he'd be in there scribbling away, and then he'd come out and he'd play the piano for a while, and then he'd go back and write some more. I've watched mathematicians at blackboards, and there's nobody more gestural and more animated than mathematicians writing things and communicating with each other. All of this stuff, it reminds me of Corbin's little quip about abstraction and philosophy. And honestly, this fits right into this discussion. Corbin says, Aristotle's abstract categories are merely the dead bodies of angels. And for Corbin, that was literally true, because everything in his cosmos had a little bit of personhood. It had some, we say, personality, and I didn't quite get it. But you see how Lou Andreas Salome's experience of love with Rilke expanding into the dusts of the cosmos expresses exactly that sense of relationality and kinship with every kind of being. And you bring it back into the classroom, and if your students don't see the number one as somehow personified in even the slightest degree, they're not going to care about it. And every teacher knows that. Every good teacher knows that in some usually unconscious way, that you have to bring things to life for people. And we say, oh, it's projection. Well, no, but it is imagination. It's connection. That's what's at the root. That's one way of talking about the imagination.
Tom, you have written several books. If people want to learn more about this topic, which books would you recommend them to read?
It's hard for me to say because I wrote them.
Yeah, but there is a focus behind different books.
Yeah,
different books have different focus. So give people a little bit of guidance which ones are
I can do that. I can surely do that. The first one, and I even forget which order they were written in. I know the first one was The World Turned Inside Out, and that's recently in a second edition with some corrections and maybe a new preface or something, but essentially the same book. That one I wrote for myself. I actually wrote them all for myself, but that one I wrote for myself in order to figure out Henry Corbin. I sat down thinking I have to put something down because I've been reading this guy for several years and I'm totally confused. And so I just started writing, and I thought it was going to be a long article, and it was a very long article, and I sent it off to somebody who knew Islamic studies, and he said, oh, this is really good, which totally surprised me. And it seems to work for people as an introduction to Corbin. And it's been translated into Farsi and French, so there's that. So that's a place to start for an intro to Corbin. And then all the other books were me following these threads along and going in different places. My own opinion is that the last book, Imaginal Love, is probably the easiest to access, because by that time I'd been writing long enough to have pretty much gotten rid of all the academic claptrap. It's still full of footnotes because I adore footnotes, but it's written in a much more conversational, sort of style. I think they get better in that respect as I went along. So if you're interested in my ideas, such as they were years ago, read Imaginal Love. And if you're interested in Corbin, you read The World Turned Inside Out. But I have to say, many people like the Green Man book. Depends. I'm very fond of After Prophecy, though nobody ever talks about it to me. So maybe I should tell people to read After Prophecy because it's got cool stuff in it and nobody ever reads it.
Yeah, but we've read this one, so this one is totally on top of my list anyway. So if anybody interested, go ahead.
All the World an Icon, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Delightful book.
Oh, that's going to be translated too, it seems to me. Maybe that was translated into Spanish. You can cut this part if you want, but I still remain totally astonished that anybody reads what I write, because I wrote it all for me, and I'm a biologist. I don't know this stuff. but by some...
People might disagree with that, I think.
By some twist of fate. I mean, people have said, I more or less seriously, that, oh no, you were doing what you were supposed to do all the way along. And I got to say, I didn't choose Henry Corbin. He chose me. And so I guess I'm a spokesperson for him, at least in some of his. Yeah, it's fun. It's been marvelous. It's been absolutely marvelous.
Wonderful. Tom, thank you very much for this delightful conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity. I always enjoy it.
We might do a follow-up. I would love to. Anyway, there are so many avenues and topics we haven't explored. So if you would be open to it, that would be great.
Oh gosh, I love doing this.
Fantastic.
So sure, Fantastic. Yeah, I can absolutely do it again. Yeah.
And I enjoyed every moment of it. Thank you again.
Thank you.